month's time, Carol Heller went to the hospital 31 times complaining of various ailments that her doctors thought were all in her head. That is, until she died. This is how a forensic toxicologist and a middle-aged woman in a cheerleader's outfit cracked the only known case of its kind in the history of forensic science. After her divorce, Carol Heller moved to the small town of Perry, Oklahoma, to be closer to her family. With only 5,000 residents and almost no violent crime, Perry seemed like a good place to start over. Carol was fighting a lifelong battle with manic depression, also known as bipolar disorder. Although Carol became active in the local church and developed a circle of friends, it wasn't enough.
There are a lot of people who don't feel fulfilled unless they have a spouse. They want someone in their life, and she wanted a man in her life.
So Carol decided to place a personal ad in a local Christian newspaper.
She was looking for a Christian male person who could take charge of household finances, and Dennis was the one that answered the ad.
Dennis Heller was a 51-year-old handyman. When the two started dating, Carol's family made sure Dennis was aware of her past.
My parents talked to him about it, so he was aware that she had had some mental health problems.
Within a year, Carol and Dennis were married. And it wasn't long before some of Carol's old demons resurfaced.
She'd wander away from her house, and we would go find her and take her back home. Sometimes she wound up in the emergency room at the hospital. Sometimes she was taken to a mental health facility for evaluation. They were trying to get her on medications.
And my dad asked her one time, said, "Carol, have you ever thought about killing yourself?" And she says, "Well, yes." She said, "I have thought about it before."
Doctors prescribed lithium, a common medication for bipolar disorder.
Like maybe a lot of people with the bipolar, she had a lot of manic phases, but as far as being real depressed, she handled that pretty good.
The medication caused nausea, drowsiness, and slurred speech. Her doctors reduced her dosage of lithium, but her symptoms persisted. To get relief, Carol sought the advice of other doctors, but none were able to help her.
She had been in Perry, Stillwater, Ponca, Oklahoma City, and Denver, Colorado hospitals in those 10 months. I think the doctors and nurses who treated her tended to tune her out after a while.
She'd get to the hospital and they'd stabilize her, and they'd just determine that they either had solved the problem or couldn't figure out what the problem was, and they'd send her home. And a month later it would start again and it would happen again.
Carol's health problems were also causing strains in her new marriage.
When I talked to Carol, she was just so down and out. She said, "I think Dennis is getting disgusted with me." She said, "I have been sick the whole time we have been married."
Carol was convinced that it was the lithium that was causing these symptoms. So against doctor's orders, she stopped taking the medication altogether. That's when her problems really started. One Sunday, about a year after her marriage, Carol Heller was uncharacteristically absent from church. Her husband Dennis told the congregation that Carol's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Later that night, Dennis called for an ambulance. Carol was in a coma, so they transported her by helicopter to a larger hospital in Oklahoma City, some 60 miles away.
About an hour later, I got a phone call, and when the phone rang, I knew what it was. I knew that she had died.
Carol had never regained consciousness. Doctors believe Carol died of natural causes.
The cause of death was congestive heart failure. That's what they had believed that she had died from.
The medical examiner was overwhelmed with cases from the Oklahoma City bombing, which had happened just 6 weeks earlier. Many of the 168 victims of that blast still were unidentified. So no autopsy was performed on Carol Heller. In accordance with her wishes, Carol's body was cremated.
That was her wish, so my dad said there was no sense in embalming her.
In a town as small as Perry, news of Carol's death spread quickly. So did word of her husband's insensitivity.
Paramedics! When the ambulance crew arrived at his home, Dennis was on the couch on the telephone. When they walked in, he did not acknowledge them, nor would he speak to them. They asked him what room she was in, and he did not respond. And so they went looking through their apartment and found Carol unconscious in a coma on the bed.
And there was another peculiar incident at Carol's funeral service.
Dennis was sitting back in behind us about 4 rows or so. And of course, we got reports that he had been dozing off to sleep during the memorial service.
Curious about the situation, Detective Farrow went to the Hellers' apartment, where the building manager told him an even more bizarre story. The day before Carol's death, she saw huge flames coming from the outdoor grill behind the couple's apartment.
She thought at first he was cooking something, but then after he had went back in, she had looked into the grill and there was nothing in there but a bunch of burnt pieces of paper. So she really wasn't sure what he was doing out there, but and this was all prior to Carol's death.
And later that same night, the apartment manager saw Dennis carrying boxes and boxes of trash to the dumpster. Farrow discovered those boxes were filled with Carol's personal items.
I found a Bible that belonged to Carol. It was a gift from her father, and it was very old, so you could tell it was an heirloom. There was documents, there was letters. Oh God, there's just basic stuff that you would find in someone's, drawers, like dresser drawers and stuff that had been tossed in there.
But why would Dennis dispose of Carol's belongings on the day before she died? In the Hellers' apartment, investigators found something odd in the kitchen pantry, a container of antifreeze.
I've never known anyone to keep antifreeze in a kitchen. A garage, yes, but not a kitchen.
But according to Dennis, it was Carol's idea to keep the antifreeze in the kitchen.
He said that she had drank a half a gallon of antifreeze back in November, and that he had bought a new gallon of antifreeze and half of it was gone, so he thought that she might have drank it again.
Corroborating this unusual story was the fact that Dennis told Carol's sisters the same thing shortly before her death.
He said, I found some antifreeze in Carol's closet and some of it's gone. It just really flew all over me. Why would somebody mention something like that?
Yet on the night Carol died, doctors found absolutely no sign of ethylene glycol in her system, which is the primary ingredient of antifreeze. If investigators suspected foul play, they had no way to prove it, since there had been no autopsy, and Carol's body had already been cremated. Homicide detective David Farrow joined forces with his colleague Buzz Busby to look into the suspicious death of 52-year-old Carol Heller. Almost everyone they talked to told stories about Dennis Heller's unusual behavior both before and after Carol's death. To get to the bottom of the mystery, Busby and Farrow sifted through 4,000 pages of Carol Heller's medical records. To organize the materials, they used a spare courtroom and sorted the records by month. Each chair represented a different month in Carol's life. When all the records were arranged, the chair representing March of 1995 was empty. This was just 3 months before her death.
We could understand that. Since we hadn't had a chance to go through the records and read all of them yet, why would there not be records when there was records for every other month?
They soon discovered a possible explanation. In March of 1995, Dennis Heller was in jail in Oklahoma City for shoplifting. District Attorney Mark Gibson responded to the news with caution.
Well, my policy has always been that I will not file charges on a case of any kind until I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, that I have evidence to show someone beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime was committed.
And a little deeper in Carol's medical records, investigators found another clue. Shortly before her death, Carol went to a hospital 50 miles away in Ponca City complaining of slurred speech and confusion. Dr. Danny Cassidy treated Carol that day and found evidence that the acid levels in Carol's blood were elevated, a condition known as metabolic acidosis.
When he saw the elevated metabolic acidosis levels, he realized that there was only a couple of things that would cause that.
In response, Dr. Cassidy ordered more tests.
I was testing for other unusual forms of acidosis, things like methanol or I believe it's wood alcohol that is highly toxic.
Dr. Cassidy told Carol those test results would take about a week, but Carol didn't want to wait for the results.
She did not want to be in the hospital, and she didn't represent a threat to anyone or to herself, and so she could not be forcibly detained to be in the hospital. And so she left willingly with her husband.
Those gas chromatography tests found ethylene glycol in Carol's system, 6 milligrams per deciliter. Sadly, Carol was already dead by the time her personal physician got the results. Now, there was an even bigger question. How did the ethylene glycol get into Carol's system?
We've never found another case in the United States, or anywhere for that matter, where someone was gradually being poisoned with antifreeze.
But investigators had no way of knowing whether Carol ingested it intentionally in a crude suicide attempt or whether her husband had poisoned her. To find out, investigators looked for an expert in antifreeze poisoning.
We took his book and we contacted some of the people in there, and it seemed like everybody we talked to and kind of give them our story, they pointed us to Dr. Pokless in Virginia.
Noted toxicologist Dr. Alphonse Pokless is one of the world's foremost authorities on ethylene glycol. He reviewed Carol Heller's medical records and immediately noticed a discrepancy. Carol told doctors she had slurred speech, confusion, a lack of coordination, nausea, and dehydration. Her doctors attributed this to lithium, but the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning were virtually identical.
This is almost the Greek tragedy. You read the medical records. The sicker she gets, the more she becomes convinced the medications the physicians are giving her are making her ill. The more she complains about it, the more the physicians think that she's becoming paranoid.
The 6 milligrams of ethylene glycol found in Carol's system was about 1/3 the lethal dose. Dr. Pokless says this amount is consistent with slow poisoning, not suicide.
That's a strange way to commit suicide. I don't know anybody that's going to poison themselves with ethylene glycol, arsenic, or anything and make themselves repeatedly ill for 9 or 10 months to kill themselves.
But there was no scientific evidence to prove Dr. Poklis's hypothesis. There had been no autopsy. Carol's body had been cremated, and there was no ethylene glycol in her blood the night she died. It appeared that if Dennis Heller had poisoned his wife with antifreeze, he was going to get away with it. Investigators in Perry, Oklahoma faced a dilemma. Gas chromatography found 6 milligrams of ethylene glycol in Carol Heller's system just a few weeks before she died.
At least on 13 different occasions, Dennis Heller would talk to people about antifreeze and the effects it would have on you if you drank it. One of the common things he would say, and it seemed like this was always out of context, and I'm not sure what context discussing antifreeze poisoning would be appropriate, but people would say, we were talking, and Dennis just came up with a statement, did you know that 1 teaspoon of antifreeze taken every day for 10 days will kill you?
So investigators tried a different tack. They knew that Dennis Heller spent quite a bit of time in Oklahoma City, about 60 miles away. He had a girlfriend there for most of the time he was married. Her name was Karen Dawson, and she was more than willing to talk to police.
After Carol died, the girlfriend kind of put it all together and was very willing to work with us, to assist us in any way she could.
He had actually taken Carol's wedding rings down to Karen to have her try them on. This was prior to her death. Had Karen to try these things on to see how they fit, because they would soon be hers, according to Dennis.
Karen told police that Dennis was attracted to girls wearing cheerleaders' outfits, and he bought one in a second-hand store.
It's a lemon yellow 1960s cheerleading outfit with pleats that he gave to her that he had bought for Carol to wear at 53 years old.
Investigators convinced Karen to wear that cheerleader's outfit on the couple's next date, along with a hidden microphone. The two went to a drive-in restaurant. Undercover officers listened from a van across the street. Karen began by telling Dennis that if they were to have any kind of a life together, Dennis would have to be completely honest with her. Then Karen asked Dennis if he had anything to do with his wife's death.
I put it in her food.
Myself and Detective Farrell were listening on a receiving device.
He even described how he'd done it with an eyedropper, etc.
He had bragged to her that he was kind of proud that he had managed to do this and fool everyone.
That was a huge moment. That was a confession.
Ethylene glycol has a distinctive taste and odor. How Dennis placed antifreeze in Carol's food without detection will not be revealed in this program. Surprisingly, when investigators arrested Dennis Heller, he wasn't at all concerned.
He did say to the investigators that it only takes one person on a jury with reasonable doubt, and slow poisoning is hard to prove.
Dennis Heller thought he had committed the perfect murder. He thought he had covered his tracks medically.
But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. Although there hadn't been an autopsy on Carol due to the Oklahoma City bombing, the medical examiner took some tissue samples for analysis. When tested, he found calcium oxalate crystals in her brain and kidney samples. Prolonged exposure to ethylene glycol can cause calcium oxalate crystals to form, causing renal failure and death.
They were getting clogged up. She probably got a pretty good dose 2 days before she died, from what we know.
He's a cold-hearted killer is what he is. And anyone who can sit around and see somebody suffer, I couldn't even stand to see an animal suffer all that time, much less your spouse.
But what was his motive?
Dennis was of even fewer means than Carol. She had an apartment, she had a car, she had a JCPenney's life insurance policy, or at least Dennis believed that she did. he wanted what she had, and he wanted her out of the way.
When confronted with this forensic evidence, Dennis Heller pled guilty to manslaughter. In return, he was sentenced to life in prison. Had it not been for investigators' persistence, one doctor's suspicions, and the cheerleader's outfit, Dennis Heller might have gotten away with murder.
In all those visits to doctors, none of them had ever detected the antifreeze poison in her system. And that's one of the most fascinating things about the case, from my perspective, is that there is a relatively simple test that will detect it.
Carol's family credits forensic science for bringing Dennis Heller to justice.
I would like to say to the doctor who finally figured out what was going on, thank you very much from the whole family, from the bottom of our hearts. And I hope that it saves some lives, and I hope that this program will save more lives and people can be tipped off to symptoms that what is happening.
I don't think that there's anything that we can't find or do when we use forensics. And anyone who wants to go out here and commit a crime, you know, you're going to leave something, you're going to say something, we're going to find it one way or the other by using forensics.
A woman jogging along a deserted footpath in central Michigan disappeared. When investigators find her body, clues at the scene point to a killer with professional training. It took almost 20 years before an old hat and a chip of stainless steel no longer than a fingernail brought the killer to justice. On a beautiful summer day in 1986, Muriel Kirby started her day as she always did by meeting her daughter Jeanette for breakfast.
Well, to me it was a very special routine, just talking over what had been going on and what was on her mind or my mind. It was a very special, almost a friendship breakfast.
But this morning was different from the others. Jeanette didn't show up, and she never called or left a message.
She's either ill or she's overslept, because it's not like her not to make an appointment or to call and say, I can't be there today.
Jeanette's employer said she hadn't shown up for work, and she wasn't at her home either. Her mother immediately notified police. The 35-year-old divorcee with no children wasn't known for leaving town without notifying friends and family. As night fell, the sky was dark with rain clouds, and during the night, there were severe thunderstorms, the worst in years.
The night that her family realized she was missing and started searching for her, there was a torrential downpour.
I knew in my heart that Jeanette was somewhere in that storm and she needed help.
Jeanette was an avid walker, and she often explored the secluded trails of nearby Riverbend Park, an undeveloped public space of more than 500 acres.
Riverbend Park is very large. It's not what you would think of as a city park, manicured and small in size.
It's gorgeous part. The huge trees with the canopy absorb all sound. You could touch off a cannon in there and you wouldn't hear it.
The day after Jeanette disappeared, police found her car at the park. A parking ticket indicated the car had been there since the day before. A day-long search of the park turned up nothing. The search continued into the night.
I remember praying, dear God, let her be all right. I knew that it was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. Jeanette was too close to this family. She would never let us worry.
When dawn broke the next day, police found Jeanette's body in an isolated ravine just a half-mile from her car. There were clear signs of a struggle. Clothing was strewn about the area. Jeanette's broken headphones from her tape player were found yards away from her body.
From the physical evidence at the scene, the struggle took place on the walking trail itself. However, the body was dragged to a lower area by the drag marks left in the plant material and the dirt.
But investigators found something unusual at the scene. Jeanette's hands were bound behind her back with a plastic tie. Consumers use ties like this for binding electric cables. But police recognized these as the same type of ties they use called flex cuffs. Police cuffs, seen here on the left, have a metal tab inserted into the plastic head. Consumer ties, seen on the right, have plastic tabs.
That metal tab acts as like a ratcheting device, and that's what makes flex cuffs different from normal household ties.
It's not something that you can readily go and buy at Home Depot or anywhere else.
Investigators now had a potential pool of suspects, fellow police officers. Was the unthinkable possible? That one of their own had killed Jeanette Kirby? The rain that fell the night of Jeanette Kirby's murder made things difficult for investigators.
Rain is probably one of the worst enemies when you have a body found exposed to the elements, because it will destroy a lot of the evidence.
Police could find no footprints to or from the scene. There were no tire or bicycle impressions in the area. At the autopsy, the medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault. The cause of death was 3 knife wounds in her chest. In a search for suspects, investigators routinely question relatives and friends. Jeanette's ex-husband was in Florida at the time of the murder, so he wasn't a suspect. Investigators discovered that Jeanette dated casually, but none of the men she dated had a motive to kill her. It appeared her murder was a random killing, the hardest type to solve.
We don't have an eyewitness. We don't have a murder weapon. We have no DNA evidence.
But the way Jeanette's clothing had been cut gave investigators a clue.
There's this drive here, this seeking of sexual stimulation, and rather than just obtaining that through contact with the victim, in this case it had to be obtained through a particular set of behaviors involving the victim's clothing.
Her jersey had been cut up the middle, and her sweatpants had been sliced apart in squares, a methodical, time-consuming process.
You start to get a picture of a person, a very evil person, who is very angry, specifically with women, and is most likely a predator of women.
You know, I can hardly handle it now, thinking of what that person, what that dear, lovable Jeanette went through. And then he just tossed her aside, away from the path where he killed her.
The only thing the killer left at the crime scene were the flex cuffs. They were the same brand used by the local police. But the Tennessee-based company that made the cuffs had some very bad news. Virtually every police force in the country used these same flex cuffs. There were hundreds of thousands of them in existence, all of them identical. At the crime scene, no one saw a policeman in or near Riverbend Park around the time of the murder. Even policemen who were in the general vicinity of the park were questioned.
I know several police officers were investigated as a result of this homicide.
So they run down all the leads that they get, but essentially they run up against a brick wall because nothing gets them any farther in the investigation. They still have a pair of flex cuffs.
A full year passed, then 2. By the 4th anniversary of Jeanette's murder, local police had no new evidence or leads to pursue.
They kept saying, without evidence, we're not sure we're going to be able to solve this case.
It was 4 years after the murder that an incident in Leland, a tourist town 200 miles away, offered new hope. A woman there told police that a truck with police-style lights signaled her to pull over on a deserted country road. The man from the truck approached her wearing a police hat but no uniform. He ordered her out of her car and into his truck. She resisted. There was a struggle. He pulled his gun and fired a shot in the air. Just then, another car drove by. The man panicked and fled. When the investigators assigned to Jeanette Kirby's murder heard this news, they took particular notice. A man impersonating a police officer in an attempt to abduct a woman in a deserted area sounded all too familiar. Police questioned everyone they could find, looking for the owner of an unmarked pickup truck with a police-style light bar on the roof.
The gas station attendant remembered that vehicle and called the police to say he had come and gotten gas there.
Not only that, but the gas station attendant remembered that the man had used a credit card to pay for the gas. His name was David Draheim. He was a 33-year-old factory worker, a volunteer fireman, and an ex-Marine with no previous record. He had been vacationing at his parents' cabin in Glen Haven, but he lived in Ingham County in the same town as Jeanette Kirby. When questioned by police, Draheim denied he was involved in the attempted kidnapping, although the victim identified him in a police lineup. On the front seat of his truck, police found a hat from the Ingham County Sheriff's Department, the same county where Jeanette Kirby was murdered.
So they call the Ingham County Sheriff's Office and they say, do you know this person? Is he one of your deputies? Is he someone that you're aware of? Is he connected to you in any way?
He was someone that we knew on a regular basis, trusted him, knew him, believed him to be a local good guy.
Draheim worked at a wastewater treatment plant just a mile from where Jeanette Kirby was killed. Inside Draheim's truck were 2 other suspicious items, a knife and a package of plastic ties, similar to police-style flex cuffs.
The suspect has in his possession a type of ties that could be characterized as flex cuffs, although they're slightly different than the police flex cuffs. But he has these plastic fasteners in his possession.
Draheim denied any involvement in Jeanette's murder.
They didn't have the magic bullet. They didn't have the tie between him and the flex cuffs. They knew that he was found in possession of something that looked like or were called flex cuffs up north, but they didn't know where he got them.
There was no evidence tying him to Jeanette's murder, but David Draheim was convicted for the attempted kidnapping charge and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Once again, Jeanette's case went cold. Jeanette's family had remained patient, but in 1998, 12 years after Jeanette's murder, her mother could take no more. She was disillusioned and angry that her husband died before they could get justice.
Jeanette was his baby. You know, that was his girl. And how could anyone touch her or hurt her He was very angry, and he kept that anger until he died. And his wishes so many times were, if I could only get hold of him, I know what I would do.
In desperation, Mrs. Kirby contacted the state's highest-ranking law enforcement official.
And I finally went to Jennifer Granholm, the Attorney General, and asked her for help, told my story. She said, I'm going to send 2 criminal investigators on the case.
And those investigators found something that had been overlooked. When David Draheim was arrested on the kidnapping charge, the local police in Draheim's hometown failed to interview all of his friends.
For some reason, a major character was overlooked, and that was David Draheim's best friend at the time of the murder. He had never been interviewed.
That man was Mark Grieco, and he told police an interesting story. A few years before Jeanette Kirby's murder, Draheim and Grieco shared a house and both worked together as security guards. At the time, Grieco owned a used police car, which Grieco, pictured here with the car in 1984, was refurbishing.
I was actually physically inside the trunk, trying to run the wires up through the dash, and that's when I found the plastic bag stuck in between the inner and outer fender well of the car, and it turned out to be the bag of flex cuffs.
These were police-issue flex cuffs that had been overlooked when the car was sold. Grieco said he kept one for himself and gave the rest to Draheim.
I gave him flex cuffs. I know I gave him some flex cuffs way back in 80-something when I bought this car.
And Grieco had yet another story. He said he put his flex cuff in the brim of his security guard hat. It's a common practice in law enforcement. Police naturally asked Grieco whether he still had his security guard hat.
I'm kind of a pack rat. Sure, I kept everything.
Deep in his basement, among dozens of boxes of clothing and souvenirs, Grieco found that very same hat he wore as a security guard 15 years earlier.
The odds of that happening are astronomical, and the importance to the case cannot be overstated.
Inside the brim, just as he said, was a set of police flex cuffs. It was the same make and model used in Jeanette Kirby's murder. But investigators wanted to find some way to tell whether these 2 sets of cuffs were scientifically related. After years of searching for Jeanette Kirby's killer, investigators finally had a break. They discovered a police flex cuff similar to the one used in the murder. To learn more about how these flex cuffs are made, Michigan investigators went to Monterrey, Mexico, the only factory in the world that makes this brand of flex cuffs. This is the video shot by those investigators. Since the cuffs were all made with the same plastic, its chemical makeup provided no basis for comparison. But the stainless steel tabs in the flex cuffs were another matter. A carbide saw cuts the tabs from large spools of steel. The cut marks at the end of each tab are distinctive.
And it is a very fast process and just is continually cutting for hours at a time. Well, during that process, the blade starts to wear a little bit. And while it's wearing, the marks that it's leaving on the metal tabs are changing.
The flex cuffs used in Jeanette Kirby's murder and the flex cuffs provided by Mark Grieco were analyzed by Scott Marrier of the Michigan State Police. Using a soldering iron, he carefully removed the tab from each cuff for comparison. After all these years, the case came down to some tiny slivers of stainless steel.
There was a time when I was looking at this metal tab thinking, the entire case rests on the identification of these metal tabs.
Using a comparison microscope, Marrier placed each tab on a putty platform, then compared the two side by side. He was looking for signature marks made by the saw that cut the tabs. Marrier soon discovered that the marks were strikingly similar. They ran down the length of each tab, almost like both sides of a zipper.
Quality of the identification was so good that it would not surprise me at all if these two metal tabs had been produced consecutively.
It was an absolutely perfect match. So perfect that it took everyone's breath away.
Now prosecutors and investigators had a piece of evidence that was a piece of scientific evidence that put David Draheim at the scene of the crime.
On June 12, 2002, David Draheim went on trial for Jeanette Kirby's murder. Prosecutors believe Draheim left his job at the water treatment facility around 4:30 on the day of the murder and drove to River Bend Park, less than a mile away. Prosecutors say Draheim was a predator, and when he saw Jeanette Kirby, he was prepared.
He probably allowed her to jog or fast walk past the point where he was hiding and attacked her from behind. Immediately grabbed her hands behind her back and flex cuffed her.
Now she was immobilized and isolated. Jeanette Kirby was murdered and her clothes cut in meticulous detail.
Jeanette Kirby was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's no other link between the two of them.
That could have been me. That could have been any woman I know. And those moments that she spent before she died had to have been terrifying.
At the trial, a surprise witness came forward saying that Draheim had flex-cuffed her years earlier.
He brought my other arm behind me, and I was tied. I was strapped. I was just strapped. I couldn't go anywhere.
And it was Draheim's wife who provided the most unusual bit of testimony. She told jurors he routinely jogged with a small packet of flex cuffs in a bag he wore around his waist.
Why on earth would he need that equipment with him when he went out on a daily jog? The only reason was either it was there because it was part of the daily fantasy that he carried with him in his head, or it was there because he was hoping if some opportunity came up, it would be there when he needed it.
David Draheim was found guilty of Jeanette Kirby's murder and was sentenced to 60 years in prison in addition to the 40 years he was already serving. Forensic science solved a case which might have gone unsolved had it not been for the persistence of Jeanette Kirby's mother and a man who never threw anything away.
The science doesn't age. The tool marks that are left on those metal tabs will be there forever. They'll never change.
Thankfully, forensic science did solve it for us, and we can rest in peace knowing that her case has been solved because of forensic science.
When a small child disappeared in Alaska, investigators were initially unsure whether the cause was a grizzly bear or an abduction. The discovery of a fiber, a piece of molten steel, and a chip of yellow glossy paint pointed police in the direction of a human, but others weren't so sure. As the Alaskan summer drew to a close in 1991, children in the small town of Taslina spent as much time outside as possible. They knew that in just a few short weeks, school would start, and along with it, the cold Alaskan winter. The Lemaire family enjoyed life in the Alaska wilderness with hunting, fishing, and riding four-wheel vehicles. 11-year-old Mandy Lemaire was the oldest child.
She was a real interesting mix between a tomboy and a pretty little girl. She could be just as comfortable in a frilly dress at a social event as she could in hip boots standing on the river fishing.
The town of Taslina has only 241 residents, so the homes are situated some distance apart. Mandy and her best friend April often walked a mile or more to meet their friends to play. That was the plan on August 22nd, 1991.
Mandy and I took off. We got about down to the wheelbarrow down there. I had a big fanny pack on and I had tripped and skinned up my leg. I came back up here to the store and they helped me out. I got all cleaned up. Mandy was supposed to wait for me.
But Mandy may have grown impatient.
I ran back down, didn't find Mandy. Mandy always played pranks, and so we thought she was hiding in the bushes, was gonna come out and scare us or something. She never did.
2 hours later, Mandy's father called police. Within hours, 75 friends and neighbors passed out flyers and searched the heavily wooded area from the ground and from the air.
I knew that there was something wrong, and that there was no way that she could have got lost.
Alaskan State Trooper Jim McCann drove 5 hours from Fairbanks to join the search.
I came down here with the opinion that there's more to this than certainly a grizzly attack or a child lost in the woods, just from what I read in the paper and from what I'd been told over the telephone.
This is the poster they hung out when they found out Mandy was missing. It says, "Missing, Mandy Lemaire, long blonde hair, straight, 5 foot, weighs 105 to 110 pounds, age 11. I wrote she was my best friend."
The search lasted for days. Search dogs were used, but they weren't able to track Mandy's scent.
I've never seen such community action. I've been in on it and headed up a lot of searches. This community was just marvelous. Everybody from the valley got together.
Tragically, 10 days after she disappeared, searchers found her body. She had been shot to death.
She was found about a mile from her home off of Taslina Terrace Road, back a side road in a new subdivision there. Her body was found off that road that went down to the river from that area.
Without you have living something like this, you probably will never have a clue. And I don't know that I can describe it. My wife at the time, she ultimately couldn't handle it.
I don't think no matter what you do, you always feel some kind of guilt. And that was the big thing. If I hadn't tripped, what would have happened? And I remember asking my mom that. What would have happened if I hadn't tripped?
Complicating matters, there had been heavy rains a few days before the body was discovered, washing away possible trace evidence as well as foot and tire impressions.
It was clear to us that she'd been alive when she was down in that wash and had been struggling to climb back up out of that wash. Her little fingernails were broken and filled with dirt.
Police knew they'd have to work harder than usual to find necessary clues. Mandy Lemaire's autopsy revealed she had been shot twice at close range with a .22 caliber rifle. There were signs of sexual assault. In a search for suspects, An informant told police that construction worker David DeForest showed an unusual interest in the case and spoke of it constantly at work. 20 years earlier, DeForest was convicted of a car theft in New York State and had some recent brushes with the law.
He had been in some trouble recently when he went out of state, and he was a suspect in a death out of state, too.
DeForest denied any involvement in Mandy's murder. His employer confirmed he was at work on the day Mandy disappeared, so he wasn't considered a suspect. But DeForest had some information of his own. He saw another local man, Charlie Smithart, driving his pickup truck on the road where Mandy was last seen.
He was described as a good guy to the kids, that all the Copper Center kids would come to his shop and he would fix their bicycles, give them candy. Certainly interesting to us.
61-year-old Smithart was a retired steel worker, had been divorced twice, and lived in a makeshift workshop behind his mother's home. Coincidentally, Smithart had assisted in the search for Mandy.
He never put his name down on the search roster at the fire station to say that I am a member of this search team, I will search, but he would show up there and stand around, and then he would go off on his own. We found that strange.
Smithart denied DeForest's claim that he was near the crime scene on the day Mandy disappeared and said he had an alibi. He said he was watching television with his mother, an alibi his mother confirmed.
God knows he didn't do it. And the person who committed this crime knows that Charles didn't do it.
In a town the size of Taslina, checking an alibi is easier than in most larger towns, and it helped investigators get their first break. They learned that Smithart's mother, Lucille, had gone shopping at the Copper River Cash Grocery Store on the day of Mandy's disappearance and paid for the items with a check.
The time and date on the register tape was the same, and the time was 3:17 when Lucy said that she was home with her son. She wasn't home. She was at the grocery store buying groceries at that time.
Suddenly that blew a hole in Charlie's alibi because it meant that his mother was at the grocery store at 3:17, that she was not at home when Smithart said she was at home to bolster his alibi, and that frankly he had no alibi for the 2 hours when Mandy disappeared. This is an 11-year-old girl who had her life savagely taken from her, was brutally killed, and her body was left in the woods for animals to find. I think that made it hard on everybody that dealt with this case, and myself included.
In the weeks following Mandy Lemaire's murder, investigators had a very promising lead. A witness placed Charlie Smithart near Mandy's home on the day of the abduction. And some young girls in town had even more damaging information to report.
In the weeks before Mandy's disappearance, Charlie Smithart, a 60-year-old man, had been seen offering rides to other young girls who bore a striking resemblance to Mandy Lemaire, such that one of the young girls, when her mother saw the sketch in the newspaper of Mandy was missing, that she thought she was looking at a sketch of her own daughter.
Armed with a search warrant, investigators confiscated Smithart's pickup truck for forensic analysis. With a gel adhesive, criminalists lifted microscopic particles from the truck's interior. During questioning, investigators noticed something else about Smithart.
I couldn't take my eyes off his shirt because he had little sparkly things on his shirt. And I finally asked him, I said, "What are those little sparkly things on your shirt, Charlie?" He says, "I don't know, brass, aluminum, I'm grinding stuff all the time."
That clue led investigators to the workshop behind Smithart's mother's home. There, criminalists collected paint samples, hair, fibers, and all of the metal fragments they could find. They also confiscated a pair of Smithart's overalls. all of the evidence was shipped to Chicago, Illinois, to Skip Palahniuk, a research microscopist. Palahniuk began by looking at the small yellow paint chip found on Mandy's clothing. Using X-ray spectroscopy, Palahniuk noticed something unique.
Glossy layers with no other layers behind it in a variety of colors. That's quite unusual, and children's bicycles, of course, are painted with single layers of glossy paint.
In the samples collected from Smith-Hart's workshop, Palahniuk found a paint chip identical in elemental and polymer composition to the paint chip on Mandy's clothing.
We found one paint chip where the paint chip was, in every aspect we could measure, was the same as one of the yellow paint chips from his workshop.
Next were the red and blue fibers. Again, Palahniuk found they too were unusual.
It turns out these fibers had a very unusual cross-section. The fibers were also very brittle.
They were brittle because of degradation due to age and exposure. The fibers were triangular in shape or trilobal. Using an infrared spectrometer, Palahniuk discovered the fibers were polypropylene, a synthetic manufactured by the Phillips Fiber Company for carpeting. Palahniuk then analyzed the fibers gathered from Smith-Hart's truck and clothing.
We find in Smith-Hart's environment exactly the same kinds of fibers. Not only do they have the same cross-sectional shape, the same size, they have the same pigments that are used to color them. Everything is there.
The fibers in Smith-Hart's truck were manufactured by the same company and had the same degree of environmental damage as those found on Mandy's clothing. Finally, Palahniuk examined the most unusual evidence, the metallic spheres found all over Mandy's skin and clothing. The scanning electron microscope identified the spheres as carbon steel. From his experience, Palahniuk knew precisely what had shaped the metal in this way.
If you're using a high-speed cutting tool to cut through steel, you'll produce these little spheres. The metal particle is raised to a high enough temperature that it actually melts and assumes a spherical form.
The metal spheres from Mandy's clothing were compared to metal fragments found on the seat of Smith-Hart's truck.
These particles on Mandy's body were consistent in all respects with having originated from Mr. Smith-Hart's environment. Based on my knowledge of the particles, is that it would be extremely unlikely to have all those particles come together just by chance somewhere else.
Now armed with forensic evidence, investigators wanted to learn as much as they could about Smith-Hart's background, so they flew to California to interview one of his daughters. There, they found evidence that Mandy Lemaire wasn't his first victim.
We walked around out in her front yard and down her road for a couple of hours until she trusted me and with tears in her eyes said that her father had started molesting her, interestingly, at the age of 11, the same age as Mandy Lemaire was when she was murdered, and that all her sisters had also been molested.
After a 3-month investigation, Charlie Smith-Hart was arrested for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of Mandy Lemaire. It wasn't soon enough for Mandy's family.
I can tell you the temptation was strong to take matters in my own hands. I won't lie to you. But I had told myself that I could never explain it to two boys.
Many residents of Taslina found it difficult to believe that a neighbor could commit such a heinous crime.
The community was very split up there. It's a very half-native, half-white community. And Mandy was white and Charlie was native. And you had the split down the center, essentially. That the white community felt that he was involved and the native community felt that he was not involved.
Charlie Smith-Hart's trial began in 1993, 2 years after the crime. Mandy's parents and her 2 little brothers sat in the first row every day of the trial. Smith-Hart insisted he was innocent.
Mr. Smith-Hart, you're going to have to be quiet at this point.
What are you going to put me in jail? You going to throw me in jail? I've been in jail 20 months, falsely arrested for a crime I did not commit.
Mr. Smith-Hart, I'm going to have you removed from the courtroom.
That's fine.
I don't want to do that.
Throw me in jail. I've been in there for 20 months, falsely arrested for a crime I did not commit.
Prosecutors believe that molten steel from Smith-Hart's metalwork formed the tiny spheres that were attached to his shirt. Smith-Hart was wearing that same shirt when he saw Mandy walking to meet her friends. It's unclear whether Mandy accepted Smith-Hart's offer of a ride or whether he forced her into his vehicle. The forensic evidence suggests the tiny metal spheres attached to Smith-Hart's shirt were transferred onto the seat of his truck and later onto Mandy's clothing during the abduction. The same red and blue synthetic trilobal carpet fibers were in the truck and on Mandy's clothing. A single yellow speck of glossy paint from Smith-Hart's workshop was also found on Mandy Lemaire. Even after 2 weeks in the woods and after heavy rains, trace elements were still there. The murder weapon was never...
And hopefully I'll still be locked up. And then, what are you people going to say? If it happens, to my way of thinking, you're an accessory to him, and the troopers that investigated this case, because I know I'm innocent.
Skip Palahniuk's testimony was particularly persuasive.
My role is to come in and report factually on what I found, and then be an advocate not for one side or the other, but for my opinion. And I stated my opinion in court, and then hopefully gave the jury something useful to base their deliberations on, and finally their verdict.
I felt like they did a really good job of explaining it. I'd ask our oldest son what he heard, and he could explain it. Adults should be able to understand it.
Charles Smith-Hart was found guilty of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, and he was sentenced to 114 years in prison.
Mr. Lemaire introduced me to his son, who he said was somewhat interested in forensic science. And what he handed me is a courtroom sketch he had made, hand-drawn picture with the words written on it. "Thank you for helping catch my sister's killer." That kind of thing does tug at your heartstrings.
This crime affected everyone in Tazlina in different ways.
Now that I live in her old house, it haunts me. My memories come back. Certain smells bring back memories. My son sleeps in her old bedroom, and there's a sticker on the window that she and I had stuck there when we were little girls.
Some people think it ought to be over. It's never over. I went through awful days leading up to when Mandy's graduation would have been. For years prior, I couldn't go to graduations. Then several years after that, when girls that would have been Mandy's age were being married, I couldn't go to those. It's a whole life long. She's not here. I'm missing this time of her life.
6 years later, Alaska Supreme Court overturned Smith-Hart's conviction because some evidence the defense team had planned to introduce had been denied. Smith-Hart died of lung cancer in an Alaska prison while awaiting a retrial. just weeks before testifying at a criminal trial. One of the key witnesses, a brilliant research scientist, was murdered. For 15 years, there were many suspicions, but little proof. Ironically, advances in the very research the victim had been working on helped nail her killer. When you ask friends and colleagues about Helena Greenwood, you hear words like brilliant, quiet, honest, and a hard worker. Helena earned a PhD in microbiology and was an executive in the biotech industry.
She not only was an excellent scientist, but she had marketing skills. And those two things often are not concurrent.
Helena was very forward-thinking, especially looking at technology. But she also knew the power that technology by itself doesn't market a product. Basically, it's the human need. If there's a human need, there's a product that's required.
Helena and her husband Roger, a landscape designer, lived in Atherton, a quiet suburb outside San Francisco. Our story begins on a Saturday night in April of 1984 when Roger was out of town on a business trip. In the middle of the night, a man suddenly appeared in Helena's bedroom and threatened to kill her. Helena was sexually assaulted, then robbed, before the assailant made his getaway.
Dr. Greenwood described her assailant as being fairly tall, slender, athletic, with a complexion perhaps of part half black or Hispanic person, a olive complexion. She couldn't see his face because he had a hooded sweatshirt pulled up so that only his eyes showed.
The assailant entered the home through a kitchen window. But it was Helena's friend who found a key piece of evidence that police had overlooked. Outside on the deck near the kitchen window was a teapot from Helena's kitchen. Fortunately, the friend had the good sense not to touch it.
That teapot was taken into evidence, taken to the crime lab, and fingerprints were developed. Imagine the teapot. There were 3 fingerprints in this position as though someone had picked up the teapot from the windowsill and placed it on the deck.
Helena told police she made tea before going to bed, then placed the teapot on the windowsill. It appeared the assailant moved it before crawling through the window. Unfortunately, the fingerprints didn't match any on file with the police department. With no other leads, the case went unsolved until 1 year later.
A man was arrested while exposing himself to a 12-year-old girl outside an apartment in Belmont, California. That suspect was David Paul Frediani.
Belmont was only 7 miles from Helena's home. The suspect, David Paul Frediani, was a 42-year-old accountant with no prior arrests. Since Frediani resembled the man Helena described, police compared his fingerprints to those found on Helena's teapot. They matched.
One of the things I asked him was, he had denied even being involved in the initial sexual assault against Mrs. Greenwood. And I remember asking him, you never assaulted this woman? He says, no, I never did any of that.
They then told him, we have your fingerprints. At that point, according to Detective Chaput, Frediani took a deep breath, let it out, began trembling. He could actually see his chest moving in and out, and made a statement to the effect as, I was really drunk when I did those things. He then asked for a lawyer and refused to make any more statements.
At the preliminary hearing, where both Helena and Frediani were present, she was asked if she could identify him, and she couldn't, not positively. And out of that arises one of the great mysteries of this whole case.
But the fingerprints on the teapot were all the prosecution needed, so the case headed to trial. Sadly, Helena Greenwood didn't live long enough to testify in court. While her sexual assault case was pending, Helena Greenwood and her husband Roger moved from San Francisco to San Diego. She took a new job with GenProbe, a biomedical research firm that was looking for ways to diagnose disease through DNA.
It would be more specific or more accurate. It would also allow the testing to be more rapid, cutting down tests that would take sometimes weeks just to days, or things that would take days just down to minutes.
One morning before work, Helena was at home on the phone, making last-minute preparations for an important company meeting.
Helena was very prompt. She would always come in at 9 o'clock.
But on this day, she never arrived. Co-worker Sam Morishima had a feeling that something was terribly wrong.
Because she would have at least called. And again, she was very precise on her arrival at GenPro, being at 9, especially if she had a meeting with someone.
Co-workers called Helena's husband at work. He immediately drove home and found the front gate locked. When he peered over the fence, he saw his wife's body.
Roger was in total shock. And he first called GenPro. He didn't call the police, he called GenPro. That shows how disoriented he was.
We rushed down to the house. The police tapes were up. They wouldn't let us through the gate. But you knew that just from the talk that was going on, that Helena was assaulted right behind that gate door in the courtyard.
The crime scene appeared to be staged. It had the earmarks of a robbery, but no money was missing from Helena's wallet.
You had her purse that was strewn about. They preserved all of that for fingerprints or other evidence, of which unfortunately there were none.
There was no physical evidence left. Obviously he wore gloves. I mean, one safely can assume that, I guess.
And it was clear that Helena valiantly fought her attacker.
This woman put up a hellacious fight. Obviously, it was evidenced by the fact that her fingernails were actually, 2 of them were found at the scene. She had broken them off while scratching this person.
At the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered petechial hemorrhages in Helena's eyes, an indication of strangulation. There were no signs of sexual assault. But under Helena's fingernails were tiny traces of what appeared to be blood. Unfortunately, the sample was too small for forensic analysis.
I mean, what comes to mind when there's a bizarre murder, you know, a strangulation in broad daylight? You think marital trouble, you think crime, you think drugs. I mean, Helen never got within 1,000 miles of any of those things, and that simply deepened the mystery.
Helena's husband, Roger, was the first person police interviewed.
He was just so mad at the police at the time because he was just, they were accusing, I mean, he was a suspect, and he was just saying, he says, why are they, you know, doing this to me?
Whenever a woman is killed, the prime suspect is generally the husband. And statistically, that bears out. Most women who are killed by someone well known to them, usually a romantic interest, and the husband is often the perpetrator.
Roger said he left home at 8 a.m. and was at work at the time of his wife's murder, around 9 a.m. Records indicated Helena had been on the telephone until 9 a.m., about the time a neighbor heard a commotion.
One man who lived next door said about 9 o'clock when he was shaving, he thought he heard a human, an abrupt human cry, but who knows?
When police confirmed Roger was at work 40 minutes away at that time, he was eliminated as a suspect. Helena's murder also meant that she would never testify at the sexual assault trial back in San Francisco.
I got a call from Roger Franklin, who was Dr. Greenwood's husband. Roger told me that his wife had been murdered in San Diego, the San Diego area, where they had moved after the sexual assault. That was a sickening moment because he also told me that her purse was found near her body, her car keys were there, her credit cards were there. It didn't appear that there had been a robbery.
David Paul Frediani, the man accused of Helena's sexual assault, had been out on bail at the time of Helena's murder, but insisted he was 500 miles away in San Francisco. Investigators were naturally suspicious.
He was the only person who conceivably had a motive for doing this.
The prosecutor refused to drop the sexual assault charges against him. But everyone wondered whether the prosecutor would ever get a conviction now that his witness was dead. Just 3 weeks before she was scheduled to testify in her sexual assault trial, Helena Greenwood was murdered in her front yard. David Paul Frediani went on trial as scheduled for Helena's sexual assault. Prosecutors had his fingerprints on Helena's teapot, and they also found serological evidence.
We also presented evidence that the semen on the pillowcase in Helena Greenwood's bedroom, first, that it was semen, second, that it was from a type O individual who was a secretor, and that a PGM type, phosphoglucomutase of 1+, all matched Frediani's ABO type.
DNA testing in 1985 was still in its infancy. At the last minute, when faced with the fingerprint and serological evidence, Frediani pleaded no contest to the assault and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But Frediani said he was innocent of her murder.
They knew who killed Helena Greenwood, and they knew it was David Paul Frediani, but they couldn't prove it.
Eventually, Helena Greenwood's murder was relegated to San Diego County's cold case files and forgotten. Over the next several years, Helena's parents died. Her husband, Roger, developed cancer, and he too passed away.
And who is there to mourn for Helena? Very few, and growing fewer.
And GenProbe went about the work Helena had been pursuing before her death, looking for ways to use new DNA technology for quicker, faster medical diagnoses. David Frediani served only 3 years of his 5-year sentence and was released. He returned to his accounting practice.
This is a very egotistical, self-centered, obviously sociopathic person. Hey, I just got away with murder, and his life went on and he prospered.
And that's where the case stood for another 10 years, until investigators in San Diego's cold case unit decided to take a second look at Helena Greenwood's murder. And deep in Helena's file was a piece of information that immediately caught investigators' attention. 7 days before Helena's murder, David Paul Frediani was involved in a minor traffic accident in Southern California, not far from Helena's home.
The defendant had no business being in Southern California. We knew he knew she lived down here, although we didn't know how he had that information. But it just seemed a little bit strange that he's awaiting trial, he lives in San Francisco, and he takes a trip down to Southern California.
As detectives looked through the evidence, they noted there was a tiny speck of blood under Helena's fingernail, at the time far too small for DNA testing. Had forensic science advanced to the point that it could identify a speck of blood almost too small to see? For 13 years, the murder of biotech research scientist Helena Greenwood went unsolved. The medical examiner found what looked to be blood under one of her fingernails. At the time, it was far too small for DNA analysis. By 1998, however, work the Gen probe and scientists like Helena Greenwood had been working on led to new developments in DNA testing. One of the most important was polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, which enabled scientists to copy minute DNA samples until they were large enough to test.
Polymerase chain reaction allows you to make a geometrically increasing number of copies, where you start with 1. After 1 round of PCR, you end up with 2, and then 4, and then 8, and so on. The big advantage of PCR for forensic work is that it is so sensitive. A very small amount of DNA can yield a very large amount of information.
It's a fortunate thing that they didn't try to test it at the time, because as you test biological material, it's destroyed. And had they, at the time of Helena's autopsy, tested that material, they would have found nothing, and the material would have been destroyed.
When the biological material from Helena's fingernails was tested using PCR, scientists made an important finding.
On some of the fingernail clippings, they found only DNA that was consistent with Dr. Greenwood's. And on one of the clippings, they found DNA that was essentially pure. It was not from Dr. Greenwood at all. And that's when they got very interested, because of course the possibility is that that's the perpetrator's DNA.
And investigators found even more evidence on Helena's clothing. On her nylon stockings were grab marks, so they decided to test that area for microscopic traces of blood, and found some. The DNA from Helena's fingernail and stockings was compared to a blood sample from David Frediani. And here are the numbers. The odds that the DNA under Helena's fingernail and stockings was someone other than David Frediani's was 1 in 23 billion. He could hardly believe it when police arrested him.
Mr. Frediani came out of his house and began walking to his car, and that's when we approached him and placed him under arrest. His reaction was all the color just rushed from his face. He turned white. I think he knew at that point that he wasn't going to be looking over his shoulder anymore. It was over. And great satisfaction for us.
David Paul Frediani was charged with first-degree murder.
One of the tragedies, of many tragedies in this case, is that Roger never lived to hear that Frediani, who he knew had done the murder, he never lived to hear that the San Diego authorities were able to identify Mr. Frediani as the murderer.
Prosecutors believe Frediani murdered Helena in the mistaken belief that her death would end the sexual assault case against him.
He wasn't smart enough to understand that just because he killed Mrs. Greenwood, that her preliminary testimony was still going to be used. He didn't realize that was the error in his plan.
He drove 500 miles from his home in San Francisco to Helena's home in San Diego to stalk the couple and learn their schedules. His first mistake was getting into a car accident a few days before the murder, proof that he was in San Diego before the crime. Frediani learned that Roger left for work every morning around 8 a.m., about an hour before Helena. Prosecutors believe Frediani waited for Helena outside her front gate He was wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints like he did when he assaulted Helena a year earlier. When he heard Helena close the front door, he made his move. Frediani probably believed the gloves would protect him and didn't realize he left crucial forensic evidence behind. Ironically, it was Helena who grabbed it.
I can only imagine what was going through Helena's mind, that this man who assaulted her is obviously coming to do harm to her. Maybe it's just a little too much to think, but she scratched the heck out of this guy. We know she did. I almost wonder, like, hey, I'm going to leave some evidence behind to show who my killer was. I may not survive this, but by God, I'm going to leave something behind to tell you who killed me. And I think this is what happened in this case.
At the trial, under cross-examination, Frediani admitted to the sexual assault, but he did not confess to her murder. Regardless, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
We expect victims to testify, and that's what Helena Greenwood did. She testified against the defendant at the preliminary examination, and then he tracked her down and he killed her. And no conviction is justice for what happened to her. But ironically, the science that she was working on, in fact, helped put away her killer.
For 6 years, a serial killer prowled the streets of New York City, hunting his victims. He promised to kill 12 people, one for each astrological sign, and he only struck while certain constellations were visible. It took forensic astronomy, handwriting analysis, and a World War II codebreaker to find him. Late one cold night in March 1990, 49-year-old Mario Orozco was walking home from his restaurant job in Brooklyn. Without warning, he was shot in the back. Mario survived, but he couldn't describe his attacker. 3 weeks later, there was a similar incident a few blocks away. 34-year-old factory worker Herman Montenegro was walking home after a serious night of drinking when someone shot him in the back. He too survived, but he didn't see the gunman either. Police recovered the 9mm bullet.
There were no grooves on the bullets, and we're probably dealing with a zip gun type of homemade weapon.
2 months later, a short distance away in Queens, 78-year-old Joe Proce was about to open the door to his apartment when he was shot with a 9mm zip gun. Proce died later at the hospital. This time, the killer left a note beside the victim. It was a threat to kill 12 people, one for each astrological sign of the zodiac.
This is the zodiac. The 12 signs will die when the belts in heaven are seen.
The next day, a similar note arrived at the offices of the New York Post newspaper.
It was so crazy. There was this wheel with signs of the zodiac, and this one, it was unusual. It was a little different. Most are just scribbled lunacy. And this guy was organized. He's got this chart, and it was bizarre.
The killer called himself the Zodiac. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for the 3 shootings, but he mistakenly believed that he had killed all 3. It was apparent the Zodiac knew his victims' birthdays and astrological signs. Mario Orozco was a Scorpio. Herman Montenegro was a Gemini, and Joe Proci was a Taurus. But how did the Zodiac know the victims' astrological signs?
Are you kidding? It freaked them out completely. The New York City Police Department went into the biggest manhunt. It was mammoth, and it was driving them crazy.
At this point, investigators realized the Zodiac had contacted them before. They just didn't know it. 3 months earlier, he had written a letter to police headquarters, but it was ignored.
And basically, it was viewed humorously. Here's a nut letter. I believe it was posted on a bulletin board. It was not taken very seriously.
This letter held yet another clue.
The Zodiac will kill the 12 signs in the belt when the zodiacal light is seen. Orion is the one that could stop Zodiac and the 7 sisters.
An astrologer told police that the constellations Orion and the 7 sisters of the Pleiades were not visible on the nights of the shootings. The Zodiac's letter implied he wouldn't strike when Orion and the 7 sisters were in the sky.
This thing was all over the newspaper now. I mean, this guy's claiming the Zodiac. So now this thing is really a hot potato. It's like the biggest case in years in New York City.
25 years earlier, a man in San Francisco killed 6 people and wrote taunting letters to police. He too called himself the Zodiac and was never apprehended. Was it possible the San Francisco Zodiac was now in New York City?
If the Zodiac from California in the 60s had resurfaced in New York, they knew this was a complete law enforcement nightmare.
New York City police were searching for a killer who called himself the Zodiac. He promised to kill 1 victim for each of the 12 astrological signs.
Before the Zodiac killer in New York, when the guy said to a girl, "What's your sign?" he was hitting on her. Afterwards, I mean, there was literally a case where a guy asked a girl a sign and she screamed for the police.
Handwriting experts compared the New York Zodiac letters to those written by San Francisco Zodiac killer 25 years earlier.
One characteristic of this writer is that he makes his horizontal lines in a descending way. His T-bars tend to descend. The crossbar on his lowercase f's tend to descend.
Handwriting experts concluded that the San Francisco Zodiac and the New York Zodiac were 2 different men. Investigators now realized they were dealing with a very sophisticated copycat. The shootings had taken place at 21 and 63-day intervals, suggesting variations of a 3-week cycle. And they happened on nights when the constellations Orion and the 7 sisters of the Pleiades were not visible in the sky.
The planets aren't just named after gods and goddesses, they were the gods and goddesses. The stars also were either homes of gods or the lights into heaven. So these are powerful ideas, these are powerful symbols.
To predict when the Zodiac would strike next, police asked astronomer Gregory Matloff to identify the next time within the 21-day cycle that Orion and the 7 sisters would not be in the sky. He did so by consulting his astrological charts.
By just adjusting this for time and day, and in some cases location, your latitude, you can see what is rising and what is setting.
Matloff predicted Zodiac would strike next on June 21st, the summer solstice, the longest day of the year.
So we have hundreds of plainclothes detectives out on nights when we think this guy is going to shoot again.
And the Zodiac was even more clever than anticipated. He did strike, but not in the same area as before. This time, it was in Manhattan. He shot a homeless man, Larry Parham, who was sleeping on a bench in Central Park. In the victim's shoe was a note. The Zodiac somehow knew that Larry Parham was a cancer, a sign different from the other 3 victims. And Zodiac registered his indignation that the newspapers were calling him a copycat.
One Zodiac.
He's angry. He's trying to convince us, no, I'm the Zodiac, just one Zodiac. And, you know, we knew it wasn't him. We knew it was a copycat.
To look for forensic evidence, criminalists saturated the letter with ninhydrin, a chemical that reacts with the amino acids from skin oils. Then, the letter was placed in a humidity chamber for several hours. The moisture in the chamber accelerated the chemical process, eventually revealing an almost perfect thumbprint. This was photographed and then compared to prints in every fingerprint database available.
They did databases for city employees, Department of Motor Vehicles, postal workers, and they were going through those databases, including police officers. Every police officer in New York's fingerprints were compared to the Zodiac's. Believe me, they tried it. And nothing. No hits.
There had been no witnesses. None of the surviving victims could give a description, and the only forensic evidence was a single fingerprint. Zodiac claimed that only the constellations Orion and the Seven Sisters could stop him. New York police hoped to add themselves to the list. The Zodiac killed 1 man and wounded 3 others in New York City. And for some unexplained reason, he struck only on nights when the constellations Orion and the Seven Sisters were not in the sky. Just as unusual was the fact that he apparently knew the birthdays of all 4 of his victims. And it was clear from the Zodiac's letters that he was following the investigation in the newspaper.
I printed a story that the police had his fingerprints. He messed up, and I'm convinced that as soon as he saw that, you know, he folded his tent, because he knew that once they had fingerprints, if they had comparison, he was cooked.
And for almost 2 years, there were no more Zodiac shootings. It wasn't until 1994 that the Zodiac sent his next letter announcing his return. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for the stabbing death of 39-year-old Patricia Fonte in Highland Park. Patricia was a Leo. And 40-year-old Joseph Diacone was shot and killed while he was walking near this highway underpass. Joseph was a Virgo.
The bullet was a through-and-through wound which severed his carotid artery, and he bled to death there within moments, certainly.
Zodiac's next victim, 40-year-old James Weber, was shot in the same location. He was a Libra, and fortunately, he survived the attack.
He snuck up behind them, gave them no warning, and just shot them and ran away, laughing. According to Weber, Weber said after he was shot in the buttocks, he heard him laughing as he jumped into the cemetery.
Amazingly, each of Zodiac's 7 victims had a different astrological sign. But the pattern stopped with his 8th victim, 40-year-old Diane Ballard, who also survived the shooting, but was a Taurus, the same sign as an earlier victim. Zodiac also took credit for shooting a 9th man in Highland Park, although police couldn't confirm the shooting took place.
One of his last remarks in each of those letters, he actually says no bruise. And those are the ballistic identifiers that ordinarily most examinations and comparisons are made by in the field of ballistics.
Although the Zodiac bragged that police would never catch him, with this letter, he made a mistake. He licked the envelope flap and left enough saliva for DNA testing. Police now had the DNA profile of the Zodiac killer. The letter also included another clue.
I knew it was a code. It was 9 towers, because there were 9 victims. And I wrote down all the different symbols, and I think I had 23, very close to an alphabet. And then I did something called a frequency count, which is you write down how many times each letter is used, because, for example, E is the most commonly used letter in the alphabet.
Kieran Crowley's father-in-law had been a codebreaker in World War II. Together, they discovered that the alphabet was based on a maritime system of international flags and pendants. And with this discovery, they were able to decipher the Zodiac's secret message.
It said, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am in control. Who mastery, be ready for more. Yours truly."
The Zodiac killer had been walking the dark, deserted streets of New York City undetected for 6 years. Captain Joseph Herbert worked on the Zodiac task force, and he knew that eventually the forensic evidence would catch him.
This case is actually a study in forensic investigations, because I knew at the time from working on a task force that we had partial fingerprints from 2 of the letters from the earlier shootings. The bullets that were removed from the bodies were not traditional lands and groove bullets, but they did have barrel markings on them that could be compared to other barrels. We knew that we had a DNA sample from one of the letters.
Police continued to search for the Zodiac. On a dark, dreary March afternoon in 1996, their luck began to change.
Open the door.
A young man in a Brooklyn apartment apparently got angry because his younger sister and her boyfriend were together alone in her bedroom. He demanded the boyfriend leave. When they refused, he fired a shot through the bedroom door. When the woman ran out to confront her brother, he shot her in the buttocks with a shotgun. The police arrived to discover the man was holding his sister's boyfriend hostage. Captain Herbert was assigned as the hostage negotiator.
I'm behind one side of the door and he's on the other side of the door. And I'm talking to him. And I'm trying to articulate to him that enough damage has been done. After about 3 hours, he indicated to me that he wanted to surrender.
Herbert convinced him to put all of his weapons in buckets police lowered from the roof to his apartment window, and he surrendered. His name was Eddie Seda, a 26-year-old high school dropout, unemployed, who was still living at home with his mother and younger sister.
One days he seemed religious and quiet and shy and strange, and other days he seemed aggressive and scary.
At headquarters, police asked Seda to provide a written statement describing what happened inside his apartment. Seda complied, and when finished, he signed it with an odd symbol next to his name.
And the detective who did it looks at it and says, "What's this?" And he said that that was a symbol for God and God's love or something.
An alert police officer asked hostage negotiator Joseph Herbert to have a look. Herbert knew immediately what he was looking at.
I remember the feeling to this day. It was a very calm feeling, because I knew we had it. I studied those letters for 4 years, and it was ingrained in not only my memory, all the guys who worked the Zodiac Task Force. The statement out of my mouth was, as sure as I'm standing here, this is Zodiac Killer.
To prove their suspicions, police turned to forensic science. First, Seda was fingerprinted. His prints were then compared with the print left on the letter in Central Park. It was a match. Next, handwriting experts compared the handwriting from the Zodiac's letters to Sada's known handwriting sample. The experts concluded they were written by the same hand. Ballistics experts examined Sada's collection of 15 zip guns. In his letters, Zodiac claimed no one would catch him because his gun barrel didn't have the traditional lands and grooves inside for testing. But the Zodiac apparently didn't know about forensic tool mark analysis.
A tool mark is a characteristic left behind during the process of using a tool to either cut, grind, file, or polish a piece of metal.
There can be hundreds of microscopic tool marks in a pipe used in a homemade gun. When ballistics experts compared the bullets from the victims to those fired from Sada's zip gun, the tool marks were microscopically similar. Finally, police asked Sada for a blood sample for DNA testing. His DNA matched the saliva on the envelope flap of the Zodiac letter.
How you doing, Eddie? Eddie, I want to introduce you to Detective Louis Savarese. Come on, Eddie.
Detective Savarese had the pleasure of telling Sada they knew his true identity.
I put out my hand and said, I've been looking for you for 6 years, and I said, you're the Zodiac. And he says, no, I'm not. I said, you're the Zodiac.
Oh, Eddie, Zodiac, no.
That was the beginning of a 6-7 hour interrogation on the Zodiac shootings until finally he did give it up. He did confess to it.
He didn't want to go to jail for simply shooting his sister in the butt with a shotgun. He wanted to take credit for his years of handiwork.
In one of his first letters, the Zodiac claimed that only Orion and the Seven Sisters could stop him. Ironically, on the day of his sister's shooting, Orion and the Seven Sisters were overhead. They just weren't visible in the overcast sky. Eddie Sada was charged with shooting 6 people and killing 3 others. Prosecutors had so much forensic evidence they had a hard time deciding how to hold the jury's interest.
We weren't certain that the public at large would be as interested in all of this forensic evidence, and we were curious about how the jury would receive it. And ultimately, we ultimately set aside a week that we just referred to as Forensic Week. We're shocked to see the jury sat on the edge of their seats.
And I just remember one morning sitting there, sifting through the guns and the knives, whatever it was that day, and looking at it, and just at that moment being struck by like, wow, what am I gonna do with this stuff? You beat the ballistics, you've got the fingerprint. You beat the fingerprint, you've got the handwriting. You beat the handwriting, you've got the statement. You beat one statement, you've got another statement.
All those forensic entities came back to haunt Eddie big time.
Eddie Sada was convicted and sentenced to 232 years in prison.
Eddie Sada was a coward. He attacked his victims from the rear. He shot them for no reason other than that he could.
But one question remains. How did Sada know his victims' birthdays? Some speculate that he looked inside his victim's wallet after each shooting, and that all had different astrological signs due to nothing more than luck. When an otherwise healthy young man died mysteriously in his sleep, investigators assumed the suicide note explained why. It told a tale of heartbreak, deception, and jealousy. But it told an expert in forensic linguistics something entirely different. Early one morning in 1992, an emergency medical team responded to a call from a Raleigh, North Carolina apartment. There, they discovered a young man unconscious in bed. A closer look revealed he was dead.
This man had no evidence of head trauma, chest trauma, any other injury that might explain why he was dead. He was otherwise seemingly a healthy young man.
The victim was 23-year-old Michael Hunter, a recent college graduate with a successful career as a computer programmer. His roommate told police he found Michael unconscious when he tried to wake him up to go to work. The emergency medical team report stated that he appeared to have gone to sleep and never woke up.
When I found out Michael had died, that was very devastating. He was just my sunshine because we had been through a lot together, Michael and I. And so when I found that out, I didn't know how I could go on.
The official autopsy was conducted 2 days later.
The initial examination revealed no intrinsic medical condition that would explain his death and no evidence of any injuries that might have any bearing on his death.
At that point, a conversation was made with the chief medical examiner for the state of North Carolina. It was determined that perhaps there should be some additional toxicology studies done.
Toxicology tests of the victim's blood told a different story. Michael had traces of 2 different cold medicines in his system, diphenhydramine and hydroxyzine. He also had a lethal dose of lidocaine.
This is a substance that is injected. This is not a substance that you take over the counter. You hear about people accidentally taking ant poison or children accidentally taking medications. This is not.
Lidocaine is an anesthetic and is sometimes used in emergency medical situations to stabilize heartbeat.
Works very rapidly, such that those irregular heartbeats can become normal again very quickly, even before you arrive at the hospital, for example, if you're in an ambulance.
But there was a problem. The emergency personnel were certain that they did not inject anything into Michael in their resuscitation efforts.
They said that they did not administer any lidocaine because Michael was gone and they knew that there was no need to try to do that.
So I would find it very unusual for there to be lidocaine in the system of someone that was not under-attempted for resuscitation.
Investigators wondered how lidocaine entered Michael's system. Then Michael's family learned about their son's secret, a secret that started to bring everything into focus. Michael Hunter's death devastated his family. And it wasn't until his funeral that his parents learned the secret their son had been hiding, the truth about Michael's sexual orientation.
I had no idea. I guess I was real naive or something, but I had no idea that Michael was gay.
Sadly, these revelations on top of Michael's death proved too great for his father, Jim.
He could not accept the fact that somebody could kill his son and then he could do nothing about it. And so this just put him in a depression that he could not and did not come out of. And he killed himself.
And now, Michael's mother mourned the loss of both the son and the husband.
It was just devastating, but because of the support, I mean, we just pulled together, and that's the support is what got us through.
Michael had 2 roommates, Gary Walston, a landscape architect, and 26-year-old Joseph Menino.
He was a medical student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, had completed his 4th year of medical school, but had not yet taken the licensing exam in North Carolina to be licensed as a physician.
Well, it was an unconventional relationship because I think in any sense of
a relationship, there are typically only two people involved. And having a third person involved, I think, brought in a dynamic that was very different and maybe in some ways very exciting, but it also created problems that I don't think any of us would have anticipated.
In almost every sense of the word, the three roommates considered themselves to be life partners.
All three men had a homosexual love triangle, as they described it. They actually exchanged rings and promised to remain faithful to each other, and that was their living arrangement.
But it wasn't long before problems developed among the three. The main problem was that Michael Hunter hadn't been getting along with Joseph Menino.
Mike and Joe started not getting along with each other, which was difficult for me because I didn't have a problem with either one of them.
Eventually, Gary and Michael decided Joseph Menino had to go.
We told Joe basically that he was going to have to move out. That was, I think, like a week before Mike was killed.
Previously, all three shared the same bed. Now, Joseph Menino was relegated to sleep on the living room sofa until he found another place to live.
Gary and Michael had formed a duo that they did not want Joe involved in, and so things basically fell apart and Joe found himself the odd man out.
Since Gary was out of town when Michael died, Joe Menino became the prime suspect. As a medical student, Menino would have had easy access to lidocaine, and he certainly knew how to give an injection. Investigators wondered whether the breakup of the love triangle might have given him a reason to kill.
No one knows what happened in the apartment that night except Joe Menino and Michael Hunter, and Michael's dead, so he can't tell us.
When questioned, Joe Menino gave police an unexpected piece of information. He admitted that on the night Michael died, he had given him an injection of antihistamines for his migraine headache. Antihistamines are an accepted but not common treatment for migraine pain. These were the same drugs found in the toxicological test.
He says that I did give him a shot to relax him. I didn't give him any other shots. I asked him directly, did he give him a shot of lidocaine? He said no.
Maybe he did have a migraine. I don't know. And Joe did give him something to put him to sleep, make him sleep sounder.
It was a violation of medical ethics, as well as North Carolina law, for a medical student to administer drugs without a licensed doctor present. This admission immediately put Menino's career at risk.
He would have completely thrown away his efforts to become a doctor. He would never have been licensed.
And investigators discovered another possible clue. A typed letter on a computer disk among Michael Hunter's things.
I started reading them, and they were what can best be described as drafts of suicide letters.
The letter, allegedly written by Michael before his death, said that he suspected that he was HIV positive and was going to kill himself.
I will use some medications I found in Joe's black bag. Please, don't blame him. Forgive me.
All investigators had to do now was confirm that Michael Hunter had actually written the letter. And for that, they turned to forensic linguistics. Suspicions about Michael Hunter's death grew even darker when a suicide note surfaced. It was unsigned, found on a floppy disk among Michael's belongings. Investigators wanted to confirm that Michael had indeed written the note and turned to Dr. Carol Chaskey, an expert in the field of forensic linguistics.
Here was a document which was purely electronic. It was simply a computer file left on a diskette. There was nothing physical in the sense of ink or handwriting or paper that was available. It was almost, in a sense, pure language.
Linguistics is not so much the study of what a person says, but how they say it. How people combine words to make phrases and sentences is known as syntax.
I think what makes individuals' use of language distinctive is the pattern of simple and complex phrases which one individual uses versus the pattern of simple versus complex that another individual uses.
Dr. Chasky was given known writing samples from Michael Hunter and asked to compare them with the suicide note. Using a new computer program called Alias, or Automated Linguistic Identification of Authorship System, Dr. Chasky reduced each document to its most basic component, the individual words. The program then rebuilt each phrase from scratch and analyzed how the words were used in relation to each other.
We can get the frequencies of how many simple versus how many complex phrases of each type, noun, verb, adjective, and so forth, are in a document.
In the suicide note, Dr. Chasky found a distinctive use of conjunctions, words like and or but. These were used not to combine phrases, but used in large sentences.
That pattern is the conjoining for sentences and not for smaller things.
The note also contained a distinctive use of adverbs. Instead of using just one adverb, the writer had a habit of combining them. This pattern was not found in Michael's known writing samples.
So given this situation of how the statistical results turned out, I can conclude that Michael Hunter definitely did not write those suicide notes.
She then analyzed known writing samples from Joe Menino.
In the suicide notes, we see more complicated adverbs than simple ones. And that's the pattern that we find in Joseph Menino's writing, more complicated adverbs than simple ones. The suicide notes were not written by Michael Hunter, and most likely were written by Joseph Menino. I think the family could conclude that not only were the suicide notes phony and concocted, but that the claims within them were also spurious.
Michael's family never believed their son committed suicide.
I knew Michael didn't write the letters. I knew Michael didn't commit suicide. And so I was very thankful for the linguistic forensics for proving what I knew all along, that Michael did not write it.
I think the letters were probably one of the first real red lights for me that said, you know, none of this is making sense anymore.
The theory that Michael Hunter killed himself was further discredited when a blood test revealed he was not HIV positive. In addition, the amount of lidocaine in Michael's body would have incapacitated him within seconds and would have killed him within 2 minutes. This made the possibility of suicide even more unlikely.
This is not a take a handful of pills, lay down on the bed, wait 30 or 45 minutes for an effect type of drug. This is a very rapid onset, so it would be very unusual for someone to have enough time to clean up, if you will, after this type of injection.
The needle would have remained in his arm. And if for some reason it didn't, it would have fallen to the floor.
No needle was ever found in Michael Hunter's bedroom. When confronted with the forensic linguistics, Joe Menino changed his story. He admitted writing the suicide note. And he also said that Michael had complained of a migraine headache the night before he died, so he injected him with lidocaine to ease the pain. Menino claimed the overdose was an accident.
Joe was very calm. He would be talking to you and then cry for a second, and then he'd talk to you again, which is very suspicious to me. If I was mourning over somebody, I'd be mourning the whole time, not just in spurts.
Now it would be up to a jury to decide what really happened the night Michael Hunter died. In 1993, Joe Menino was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his former partner, Michael Hunter.
Joe Menino had everything to live for, had a bright future in front of him. He was a couple of weeks away from graduating from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a medical degree. He was on his way to a residency and just had a very bright future ahead of him.
Prosecutors believed that Menino was a spurned lover in a love triangle and killed Michael Hunter with a lethal injection of lidocaine, so he alone could be with Gary Walston. Menino claimed Hunter asked him for an injection to help him with his migraine headache, and that he accidentally gave him too much lidocaine. Gary Walston, the former partner of both the victim and the accused, didn't believe it.
Mike had a history of migraines, and they were pretty bad at times, and Joe would occasionally offer to give him something that would help him, and Mike always refused.
There were medical cases where lidocaine had been used in small amounts to treat migraines. Menino claimed he only meant to administer enough of the drug to ease his friend's pain. But prosecutors said Menino killed Michael Hunter and then concocted the suicide note to make it look like Hunter killed himself. When that didn't work, Menino had no choice but to say it was an accident.
He might have been smart as far as his learning was, but the people who commit crimes, especially like this, normally don't think ahead.
Prosecutors said Hunter's death was premeditated murder. They argued that Joe Menino had planned the killing for weeks. They said he waited until the third roommate, Gary Walston, was out of town on business. Then, after Michael Hunter was asleep, snuck into his room and injected him with a lethal concoction of cold medicine and lidocaine.
Joe went in there, filled up a syringe with lidocaine, and very slowly and carefully inserted it into Mike's arm, and he pushed the syringe. And then he removed the syringe, and before he walked out of the room, Mike was dead.
Investigators naturally asked if Michael would have felt the injection if he was asleep.
It is certainly conceivable that a well-trained hand could place that needle and not awaken you from sleep, and then slowly administer the drug, and you may never wake up from that.
But was Joe Menino capable of murder?
It was hard for me to believe that he would have done something like that, but there were undeniable facts involved. I mean, Mike was dead. He was there with him. He was the only person there with him. He was the only person with the means. So there were undeniable facts that pointed to him that I couldn't ignore.
After a 3-week trial, Joseph Menino was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and will never be able to practice medicine. Some of the jurors believed it was possible that Michael Hunter agreed to the lidocaine injection.
The issue the jury struggled with was, did Mike consent or not? Joe said he consented. All of Mike's friends said he didn't. He would never have. And of course, Mike couldn't tell us.
I was a little surprised, a little angry, well, a lot angry. I mean, because it was like this single act had left a path of destruction a mile wide through so many people's lives. My family, Mike's family, Joe's family. And I just felt like the punishment didn't fit the crime.
It was over. Nothing that they could do to Joe would bring Michael back. And I just wanted to get on with our lives.
Though questions remain about the verdict, the forensic examination of the suicide letter was invaluable.
I think the forensic linguistics helped set the groundwork for proving that Joe was involved in Mike's death and was covering it up.
The linguistics in this case was the first time I know it's ever been used in any kind of a police investigation to assist in making an arrest. I think it was a great tool. It should be used on a daily basis.
The murder of a beautiful young woman went unsolved for years. A murder with forensic evidence and plenty of suspects. But sometimes, that's not enough. It took the victim's 9-year-old child, notations in a diary, and forensic psychology to determine which forensic evidence was important and which to ignore. Thirty-year-old Kathleen Lipscomb was trying to find her way, raising 2 young children while at the same time working as a nurse in San Antonio, Texas.
She was a very caring person. She loved her family. She stayed in constant contact with us.
Kathleen had been married for 8 years to Bill Lipscomb, a sergeant in the United States Air Force, but they had recently separated. Their arrangement was for Bill to take care of their children on weekends. But one Sunday night, Kathleen didn't arrive to pick them up as planned. Bill drove the children to Kathleen's apartment, but she wasn't there, and her car was missing, so they left notes on her door. The next morning, there was still no sign of her.
One of her co-workers called me and told me that they were worried that she hadn't showed up for work.
My stomach kind of knotted up for a minute, and then I thought, no, Bill had the kids. Kathleen probably went out with some girlfriends or something, and she'll be in. She's just late today.
Later that same day, a man spotted a nude body along a deserted road outside of town. It was Kathleen Lipscomb. It was clear she had been murdered elsewhere.
Without a doubt, she had been transported from point A to this point B, being where she was left.
The fact that Kathleen's clothing had been rolled, not folded, told investigators something important.
That's definitely military. Just without a doubt, that's the only people that I have ever seen roll their clothes in that fashion, is a military-type person.
Unfortunately, there were no discernible tire or footwear impressions near the body. Kathleen's estranged husband, Bill, was immediately called in for questioning.
I did check him to see if there were any wounds on his body, possibly any defensive wounds, to see if there was any kind of scrapes, bruisings, anything under his fingernails that would indicate where he had scratched anybody and could find none.
The children told police that their father was with them the entire weekend, confirming his alibi. At the autopsy, the medical examiner determined the cause of death was strangulation. It appeared Kathleen had sexual relations 24 hours before her death. Friends told police that Kathleen had been dating a married doctor in town, David Pearl.
Kathleen and Dr. Pearl worked together. Through their close association, Kathleen fell in love with him. And she was thoroughly confident that he loved her too. He promised to get a divorce and marry her.
We found out that Dr. Pearl had had many relationships and told his girlfriends that he was in fact separated from his wife when he wasn't. And you know, just the jealous ex-wife kind of thing, that was one concern of mine.
Dr. Pearl admitted he was with Kathleen during the weekend, but insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. And investigators had another suspect. Vincent Robideau, a nurse, worked with Kathleen at the hospital and lived in the same apartment complex. He hadn't shown up for work either.
He had left town. He didn't even go back to pick up his paycheck, nor did he even request it be sent to him.
With so many suspects, investigators hardly knew where to start. 1 week after Kathleen Lipscomb's murder, her car was found in a restaurant parking lot not far from her apartment. Investigators found no foreign fingerprints on or in the car. To determine the time of Kathleen's death, medical examiner Dr. Robert Bucks had 2 ways to tell.
She had eaten Chinese food. It was basically undigested, which indicates that she had eaten in a short period of time prior to her death.
And the marks on Kathleen's legs were identified as ant bites and helped establish a time frame.
Most of the ant activity occurs during daylight hours, so that probably occurred beginning around dawn on that morning.
These 2 indicators meant Kathleen had probably been killed around dinner time on Sunday night and dumped in the field before dawn. Forensic investigators found 4 strands of red human hair on Kathleen's clothing. Under a stereo microscope, scientists noticed the hairs had no root.
At the root end, you should see the root, which is a bulb-shaped structure, depending on what the stage of the hair growth is.
When magnified 100 times, you can see evidence that the hair was dyed.
Many times you will see an actual demarcation line between the original color of the hair at the root end to the
years away.
The hair was minus its roots. Back in 1986, in the late 80s, the forensic technology was not as advanced as it is today in 2003. So beyond that point, that's as far as we could go.
About the only bright spot in the investigation was when investigators located Vincent Robideau, Kathleen's co-worker and neighbor who disappeared the same weekend she was murdered.
He had gone back to Galveston, where he was from, and got a job there as a nurse with the local hospital because he had a fight with his boyfriend. And therefore, he just didn't want anything to do with San Antonio again.
Robideau was no longer a suspect.
We had hit a point where we didn't feel like we were going to be able to solve it without some big break-in. We just did not feel that that break would ever come.
Then investigators got another tip. Kathleen's neighbor said she saw a suspicious person leaving Kathleen's apartment on the same day her body had been found.
The neighbor actually just saw this red-headed lady walk up to the door and then a few minutes later walk away from the door.
Was this mysterious woman Kathleen's killer? For 2 long years, investigators searched for Kathleen Lipscomb's killer. Kathleen's family always suspected that her estranged husband, Bill, was somehow involved. Just 7 months before the murder, Bill had increased Kathleen's life insurance to $315,000. the family turned to a private investigator, Tom Bevins, for help. Bevins examined all of the personal items from Kathleen's apartment. In her diary, Bevins found 2 items of interest. The first was an unusual reference. It said, "Baseball tournament. Shannon Gilbert there."
When I first came across the name Shannon Gilbert, I didn't know what to make of it. It was obviously a name I had never seen or never heard of. And so my question was, why did Kathleen write it down? Obviously it meant something to her.
A background check revealed that Gilbert was in the Air Force with Kathleen's husband, Bill, and there were rumors the two were having a sexual affair. Bevins went to visit Shannon Gilbert.
She said, "Is this about Bill Lipscomb?" We said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." And she says, "I will need an attorney." And at that point, I knew I had something.
Bevins found another interesting entry in Kathleen's diary. It said, "Numerous calls and nights out, passing information about WAPS testing. Bill has all questions for the test." WAPS stands for Weighted Airman Promotion Test, which all military personnel must pass in order to gain promotion. Kathleen's entries suggested that her estranged husband, Bill, had cheated. Bill Lipscomb had been promoted faster than any other master sergeant in Air Force history. This entry possibly explained why. Since these cheating allegations involved the Air Force, Dr. Charles McDowell joined the investigation as part of the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
If you have a related peripheral crime, which in its own respect, I guess, was serious enough, but certainly doesn't compare to a murder case, that gives you a venue of access that makes it easier to get closer to your subject.
While reviewing the crime scene photos, Dr. McDowell made an important discovery.
The positioning of the body and the context of how it was found suggested to me that the scene had been staged in order to convey an impression that this was a rape murder. And this is where the victim wound up. And it didn't have a ring of authenticity to it.
Within 30, 45 minutes of reviewing the evidence, he told us that Bill did it. Bill was actually the murderer, where we had all at that point thought he just paid someone to do it.
Furthermore, McDowell believed Kathleen's crossed legs revealed the body had been stored.
Opportunities for identifying, first of all, for identifying who they are, and then for playing one off against the other.
And Kathleen's daughter, now 9 years old, revealed another piece of new information.
She said to me, "Grandma, who do you think killed my mother or my mama?" And I said, "I don't know. Who do you think killed your mama?" And she told me, "My daddy did, because he wasn't where he said he was that night."
Hey, Tony, what's up, buddy?
The children now revealed they were with their father's best friend, Tony Borello, who had taken them out for dinner on the night their mother was killed.
I'm okay. You guys have...
And later that same night, the children said they woke up and discovered their father was not home and his car was gone.
I remember asking Tom Bevins one day, "What do they want? A picture with his hands around her neck?" To me, we had so much evidence that was pointing to him, and we kept getting told, "No, it's not enough, it's not enough." It was like, you know, there wasn't anybody there to take a picture for you.
Bevins then requested forensic testing of the biological evidence collected during Kathleen's autopsy to determine the identity of the person Kathleen had been with before her death. Inexplicably, in the 2 years since the murder, the sample had been mislabeled, then mishandled. Forensic testing was no longer possible. Prosecutors needed more than just circumstantial evidence to corroborate the children's story. Kathleen Lipscomb's family hired a private investigator to help solve her murder. An entry in Kathleen's diary suggested that her estranged husband Bill had cheated on his military promotion tests and that Kathleen knew it. In addition, the divorce proceedings between Bill and Kathleen had been bitter. Bill wanted custody of the children, and Kathleen wasn't about to let that happen. Was it possible that Kathleen had been using that information as blackmail in her custody battle?
She knew it, and he knew that it would bust him, so that's the button she used. I mean, she pushed it, and he told her, you know, you can't do this, because if you do, you're going to end up on a cold slab.
At the crime scene, Kathleen's clothing was neatly rolled, suggesting someone with military training dumped the body. The only other military person around Bill Lipscomb's home that weekend was Tony Borello. Months after the crime, Borello had been dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. When questioned, he was eager to talk.
He said he would go to church, he could hear God telling him, confess, confess your sins. And that's what changed Tony.
Tony Borello immediately acknowledged that he had dumped Kathleen's body in the field, just as Dr. McDowell suspected. And Borello said that Bill Lipscomb was the killer. He also confirmed something else, that Kathleen's body was stored in a cedar chest, which explained why her legs were folded when rigor mortis set in. Surprisingly, Tony Borello still had the chest. He said Bill Lipscomb asked him to dispose of it after the murder, but for some reason, Tony kept it. Forensic scientists found a tiny stain on the bottom of the chest. Testing confirmed that it was Kathleen's blood. Tony Borello met with Bill Lipscomb while wearing a hidden microphone, but he didn't say anything incriminating. So investigators devised another strategy.
This was an event that was a consequence of a marriage that went bad. There was a tremendous amount of anger. There was a tremendous amount of hostility. I wanted to see if I could feel that hostility so I could understand it and understand his reaction to it, and then develop an investigative methodology that would counter that and deal with his own psychology.
The OSI made sure that Bill Lipscomb knew he was being investigated.
I wanted him to hear footsteps that weren't there. I wanted him to have that feeling in the pit of his stomach every time the phone rang. I wanted him to worry about whether today was going to be the day that he heard the knock on the door. I wanted to raise his level of anxiety.
Eventually, Bill's former girlfriend, Shannon Gilbert, admitted that Bill once confided to her that he planned to kill Kathleen. And investigators let Lipscomb know that both Gilbert and Borello were cooperating.
Bill Lipscomb was playing mind games with us, and we were playing mind games with him.
After weeks of these psychological tactics, Dr. McDowell brought Bill Lipscomb in for questioning. Dr. McDowell vividly remembers the exchange.
All the ways this had to end, I don't understand why it had to end the way it did. Why did you kill her? And he said, I don't know why I killed her. But then he immediately caught himself and leaned forward and crossed his arms and said, I did not kill my wife. But we had him.
3 of us within the sheriff's office tried to get in on the same level as Bill and get him to break, and we couldn't do it. We could not do it.
Prosecutors believe Kathleen threatened to expose Bill's cheating on the military exams if he tried to get custody of the children. And with that, Bill sought revenge. On the day of the murder, Bill asked Tony Borello to take the children to dinner. Then he called Kathleen, asking her to pick up the children earlier than planned. When Kathleen arrived and noticed the children missing, the two argued.
Where are the kids?
They wanted to go to McDonald's, so we took them to McDonald's.
And at some point, Bill strangled her to death. Bill stored the body in a chest until nightfall. Kathleen's blood was found in the chest. Once the children were asleep, Tony Borello dumped Kathleen's body in the field, trying to make it appear to be a sex crime. But the positioning of the body and the fact the body was uncovered revealed the truth that someone other than the killer was involved. But what about the red hairs on Kathleen's clothing?
I believe the hairs were planted by Bill Lipscomb or his partner, one of the two, to make it naturally throw us off to go looking for someone else.
Investigators later identified the woman who was seen leaving Kathleen's apartment after her murder. She was a co-worker who had gone to check on Kathleen when she didn't show up for work. Bill Lipscomb pled guilty to his wife's murder to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced. Charges were brought against Shannon Gilbert, who changed her name and is now in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Prosecutors do not believe Kathleen's boyfriend, Dr. David Pearl, had anything to do with the crime. Forensic pathology, forensic psychology, and crime scene reconstruction help solve a very complicated case.
One thing that you really do need to include is that this was a very complex investigation. It involved a very large number of people and a tremendous amount of careful coordination and orchestration. I feel kind of guilty because you're interviewing me.
People who commit crime think that they're very, very bright, and that the rest of us out here that try to solve crimes or work on crimes or are involved with law enforcement are not very bright. Most often it's the other way around.
Police officer was found shot to death in his bedroom, but it was unclear exactly what happened. Some of the evidence pointed to suicide, while other signs suggested foul play. But it took crime scene reconstruction, an automated teller machine, and some forensic textbooks in the victim's home to write the final chapter in this real-life whodunit. Traverse City, Michigan is a beautiful area for those who love sailing and fishing. And it was home to Dan and Cynthia McDonnell and their 2 teenage children. 58-year-old Dan McDonnell was a retired police officer who worked part-time as a maintenance worker. Cynthia was a freelance writer.
Everything seemed like a normal marriage. Cindy taking charge all the time. I mean, she was master of the household and the boss.
The last day in December in 1998 was a busy one for the McDonnell family. 18-year-old Patrick was sleeping over at a friend's house. Dan decided to sleep late. Cynthia and her 20-year-old daughter Erin spent the day shopping in Traverse City. For several hours, they went from shop to shop, stopping at a local department store, an office supply store, and a beauty shop. On the way home, Cynthia picked up hamburgers for the whole family. But when they arrived home shortly after noon, they found Dan in bed, dead, of a single gunshot wound.
We just walked in. I need to see if he's breathing. Okay. He's dead. He's dead. Oh God, he's dead. Ma'am. Yes, help! Father is a retired police officer and we have guns in the house.
My sister had called us on the phone and she said, I have to break some bad news to you. I just saw it on television. Your brother was murdered.
Investigators found no gun near the body, but several $100s was missing from his wallet, so robbery was a possibility.
I was devastated. I couldn't believe that this good man that hurt nobody was not living anymore.
Police were able to confirm that Cynthia and her children were out all morning. It would take crime scene reconstruction to determine what really happened to Dan McDonald. On the afternoon of New Year's Eve, 1998, retired police officer Dan McDonald was found dead in his bedroom of a single gunshot wound to his head. Dan's wife, Cynthia, told police she suspected a robbery, but there were no signs of forced entry, and police were suspicious. When police questioned Cynthia a second time, she said she had a confession to make.
I got a call that said she had changed her story. It wasn't a robbery. She came down in the morning and found that he had committed suicide.
This is a tape recording of Cynthia's statement to police.
Erin was almost ready to go, and I told her I'd get our coats and stuff and get the car warmed up, and I went in to tell Dan
that you were leaving?
We were leaving.
Okay.
Yeah.
And at that time you found him that he had shot himself?
Yes.
Okay. You found his gun that he had shot?
Yes, I did.
Cynthia told police that Dan had undergone surgery for prostate cancer, which had left him impotent. According to Cynthia, Dan left a suicide note, but she destroyed it.
The note said, I'm devastated over my prostate cancer. I want you to have the insurance money, and to the effect that if they found out that it was a suicide, there would be no insurance, and the children would not get the money.
Because I didn't want the kids.
Okay. You didn't want...
Didn't know that he'd go.
All right. You didn't want Pat and Erin to know that their father had taken his own life. Is that correct,
Yes.
Cindy? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Dan had $300,000 worth of life insurance, but the policies were negated in the event Dan committed suicide.
If there was a suicide, the insurance wouldn't pay, and the only reason we got it was for the kids' college expenses.
Cynthia said she complied with Dan's wishes and altered the scene to make the death appear to be a homicide. She said she wiped her husband's prints from the gun, then continued on the shopping trip with her daughter so she wouldn't arouse suspicion.
What we might perceive as normal response would be to just fall apart instantaneously. But not all of us are that way. Until we're in the situation, I think it's impossible to say how a human being would react.
Cynthia said she threw her husband's revolver into a nearby field, although police search dogs and metal detectors couldn't find it.
She certainly committed foul play by changing the scene. She committed foul play by disposing of the firearm. Those are pretty good indicators to open up a serious investigation.
My brother did not commit suicide. He's going to buy a boat. He was going to buy a new truck. He was going to do all these things. So a man that makes this kind of plans is not one that is attempting suicide.
At the autopsy, Dr. David Stark looked for the telltale signs of suicide. X-rays of Dan's head revealed the bullet was still inside his skull, so the wound in the back of his head was an entry wound.
It certainly raises the possibility that it's not a self-inflicted gunshot wound, that this gunshot wound could have been inflicted by another person, in particular given the location in the back of the head.
Cynthia's lawyer says that this wasn't proof of a homicide, only that Dan himself may have played a role in the deception.
If anybody has the ability to understand how to, self-inflict a mortal injury on oneself, so to speak, and make it look like a homicide, this was a man who had probably as much understanding as anybody else. And it might have been in his mind that, hey, if I can make this look like a homicide, my family will get the life insurance.
But investigators discovered something else. Cynthia McDonald wasn't just a freelance writer. She was an aspiring murder mystery writer. And police also learned that Cynthia had made some derogatory statements about them at a neighborhood cocktail party.
And she said, you could commit a murder and the police were not smart enough in northern Michigan to catch you. That didn't sit very well with the state police.
Police decided to take a closer look at some of Cynthia's stories. Police were investigating the mysterious death of retired police officer Dan McDonald. The victim's wife, Cynthia, said her husband committed suicide, and that initially she hid that fact so the family could collect on his life insurance policy. Almost immediately, forensic experts found some inconsistencies.
The X-rays show the bullet going from back to front as it goes through the brain, and from left to right as it goes through the brain.
It was obvious it would have had to come from the left side, from someone who was left-handed, and the victim, Daniel, was right-handed.
A suicide victim rarely shoots himself in the back of the head.
There needed to be some additional investigation done, that this case very well could represent a homicide, and allowed the police to further their investigation.
Investigators began their analysis by studying the blood spatter.
Whenever a blood source, be it a pool of blood or be it a head, if someone, a bullet, going through a head, that blood travels in a straight line, but it can travel in a 360-degree radius, so completely out in all directions. The blood that comes back toward the force that's being applied is what we call the back spatter.
But there was no blood spatter on either of Dan's hands. Dan's left arm was clutching a pillow and tucked underneath his body. Next to his arm was a clearly defined pool of blood. This proved Dan's left arm never moved after the shooting.
There was no change in the bloodstain pattern to indicate that that arm had ever been in any other position, either at the time of shooting or immediately after shooting. So it indicates that that was the position that that body was in at the time that it was shot.
It would have been difficult for Dan to use his right hand to shoot himself in the left side of the head.
The right hand, in order to inflict this wound, would then have to have come around the back of the head, and then being able to get the muzzle to the head, which would have to be a contortionist to do.
So you have a little bit difficulty with the trajectory, but definitely it can be done. However, once it's done, your hand is going to remain up here. It's not going to be able to tuck itself back underneath the covers, remain completely bloodless, and completely free of stippling from the cylinder gap or any powder, and end up next to the body without a drop of blood on it. That's not possible.
Investigators also found gunpowder and a bullet hole in the pillow next to Dan's body. This indicated that the gun was pressed against the pillow when fired.
The only way that this could have happened is if this person would have had 3 arms. One to hold the gun, one to hold the pillow down, and the one that he's lying on his left side.
Dan's death was ruled a homicide. A look into Dan and Cynthia's marriage revealed a possible motive. In the months before Dan's murder, the McDonalds were spending more money than they were bringing in.
Cindy was buying all of these objects like computers, like new furniture, like numerous things that were quite expensive items.
Investigators also discovered that Dan managed a trust fund for a mentally handicapped relative. In the year before Dan's death, more than $50,000 had been taken from this trust account, and the bank had been demanding answers. Bank documents showed withdrawals ranging from $200 to $1,000 almost every other day, and the fund was virtually depleted. And bank surveillance cameras identified the individual who was responsible. When police interviewed Dan McDonald's 20-year-old daughter, Erin, she remembered something unusual about the morning her father was killed.
Erin places herself in the shower and explained to the investigators that her mother came in to check on her a number of times, which was out of character. Also, turned up the radio while Erin was in the shower. She told investigators that she heard what she believed to be a car backfiring or a bang.
Inside the McDonald's home, police found forensic textbooks Cynthia was using in her research for a murder mystery she planned to write. With titles like Body Trauma and Armed and Dangerous, there were chapters entitled Accidental Shooting versus Suicide, Who Shot Whom, and Premeditated Domestic Killing. Prosecutors believe Cynthia consulted these books to plan what she thought would be the perfect crime. The motive was money. Cynthia was in financial trouble, so she withdrew $50,000 from a trust fund her husband was managing by forging his name. Surveillance cameras at the bank's automated teller machines proved it. The bank contacted Dan and demanded answers. Prosecutors believe Dan confronted Cynthia and told her he was going to local authorities with a plan to return the funds. But this would have cramped Cynthia's lifestyle. On New Year's Eve, while Erin was in the shower, Cynthia went into the bathroom to turn up the volume on the radio to mask the sound of the gunshot. Prosecutors say Cynthia took Dan's service revolver and fired it into the back of his head, using the pillow to muffle the sound. She later disposed of the gun, although it has never been recovered. Cynthia then went shopping with Erin, thinking the sales receipts would give her an alibi. Before returning home, she even stopped to buy hamburgers. She even bought one for her husband, even though she knew he was dead.
It's unimaginable that she was that conniving, to think that she could get away with it. I mean, ordering your dead husband a hamburger.
Cynthia McDonald was charged with first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense included testimony from an outside forensic expert, Dr. L.J. Dragovich, who said that it was possible Dan McDonald's death could have been suicide. Dr. Dragovich demonstrated how he thought Dan could have taken his own life and left gunpowder residue and a hole in the pillowcase.
You can have the gun in your left hand and pull the trigger with your left index finger where the pillowcase is entrapped between the muzzle and the head.
Dr. Dragovich also points out that gunpowder residue tests weren't conducted on Dan McDonald's hands, which might have proved he had fired the weapon.
It would have made a stronger case for the prosecution. Of course, had there been positive gunpowder residue on the hands of the decedent, we would have closed the case.
The medical examiner says it wasn't necessary.
We did not test for gunshot residue at the time of autopsy, and in my opinion, it would not have given any significance to the overall findings of the case, in that a person can be found with gunshot residue on their hands even if they're in close proximity to another person firing a gun. So that's a test that's, although often referred to, is not routinely performed.
As in most cases, it's the jury's job to make the final judgment.
We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder.
Members of the jury, listen to your verdict as recorded. You do say guilty of first-degree premeditated murder?
Yes.
Her daughter Erin told the judge to show no mercy.
I don't understand why this had to happen to us. We had a good family. My father was a good man. And I thought my parents had a very loving relationship. And I ask that you give the maximum. Thank you.
Cynthia McDonald was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. She continues to claim that she is innocent of killing her husband, whom she calls Mac.
Mac committed suicide. I didn't kill my husband. I loved him, had nothing to gain by his death, and everything to lose. This has devastated my children, split the family apart.
Cynthia is devoid of a conscience, devoid of any responsibility, and she will never admit her guilt. Cynthia is an individual that will resolve her problems, her shortcomings, by violence and murder.
Kevin McDonald keeps his brother's police badge close by.
What can you say? It's over and done with, but I love him. And I wish it never happened. He didn't deserve it. And I'll see him soon.
Even though Cynthia studied books on forensics, she didn't realize that science would tell the real story.
You know, maybe she had read just enough that she thought she could do it and get away with it, and had read not yet enough to realize that there's a whole lot more involved in real life than there is in the storybook version.
And Cynthia's other mistake was in changing the plot. She originally tried to make the death look like an intruder killed her husband. But when she forgot to create the illusion of forced entry, she had no alternative but to change her story.
When the officers questioned her, she blinked and went with another story that she thought they would buy. And in this case, if she wanted it to look like a homicide, it certainly did.
Cynthia McDonald bragged she could write the book on the perfect murder. Well, she should have read the final chapter, where there are no perfect murders.